Most people who had ever met Alisaa Morgan thought they knew exactly who she was. To the neighbors who saw her tending the small garden outside her apartment every Sunday morning, she was the quiet woman who liked sunflowers and rarely talked about herself. To the young engineers who worked under her at Skyark Travel Systems, she was the dependable senior consultant who always solved mechanical puzzles with a calm smile. And to the barista at the corner cafe, she was simply the iced Americano lady who handed exact change and tipped generously. No one ever suspected that behind her gentle voice and simple routines lived a story carved from thunder, metal, and fire. No one guessed that the same woman who now approached problems with soft-spoken patience had once flown at the edge of breaking speed, where a single mistake meant the difference between life and death. Alisaa had been a fighter pilot, one of the finest her squadron had ever trained, but that chapter of her life was sealed, hidden deep beneath layers of silence. She had walked away from it years ago, carrying with her memories she rarely let herself revisit. To the world, she was an ordinary civilian. To herself, she carried a past that could shake her soul if she let it resurface. Every morning, she would wake before dawn, sit at her small kitchen table and drink her coffee slowly. She liked the quiet, the stillness, the gentleness of civilian life. It reminded her she had survived something many others hadn't. It reminded her she had chosen peace after spending years dancing with danger in the sky. In her apartment, the only trace of her former life was a single wooden box tucked inside a drawer. Inside it lay 5 small items: a faded patch bearing her squadron's insignia, a pair of broken aviator glasses, a silver wing pin, a black and white group photograph, and a letter she had never been able to open. The box remained closed. She almost never touched it. Alisa's friends often wondered why she avoided flying unless absolutely necessary. For someone who worked in aviation technology, it seemed ironic that she preferred trains and long drives. When she did fly, she always chose window seats, but she never looked outside during takeoff. She kept her eyes closed, her breaths measured, and her hands steady on her lap. Because sometimes, when the engines roared during ascent, she could hear echoes, voices from her past, warnings from instructors, calls from wingmen, and the memory of the final mission that changed her life forever. It was that single mission, the one she never told anyone about, that pushed her to leave the cockpit behind. Her colleagues often described her as calm under pressure, and they were right. But they would never understand that calmness had been forged in a furnace of split-second decisions, near misses, and sky-wide battles against chaos. Despite leaving the Air Force, Alisaa had never lost her instinct. She could still predict turbulent seconds before the captain announced it. She could still tell from the tone of an intercom whether something was wrong. And she could still, even after years, mentally map the entire control layout of an aircraft cockpit. It wasn't something she tried to do, it simply happened. Yet she lived her life quietly, avoiding anything that might pull her back into that world. She had sworn that her flying days were over. She had already done her part. The skies belonged to someone else now, or so she believed. That belief remained unshaken until the day her company needed her to travel for an urgent inspection project overseas. She had reluctantly booked the flight, Boeing 804, outbound at sunrise. She told herself it was just another trip, just another journey from point A to point B. She even tried to convince herself she might relax this time. The night before the flight, as she packed her bag, something unsettled fluttered inside her chest. A familiar sensation, like her body knew something her mind didn't. She brushed it off as simple anxiety. "It's just flying," she whispered to herself. "You've done it 100 times." Still, a strange sense of anticipation followed her into sleep, weaving through her dreams like drifting clouds. She dreamed of engines humming, warning lights blinking, and a sky that seemed darker than usual. When dawn finally arrived, she stood in front of the airport terminal with her boarding pass in hand, unaware that she was walking toward a moment fate had quietly prepared for years. She had no idea that Flight 804 would not only test everything she had once been, but would make her question the promise she had made to herself long ago. She didn't know that the skies were waiting for her return. The morning sunlight streamed through the airport windows as Alisaa made her way toward Gate 18, the boarding pass fluttering lightly between her fingers. She tried to ignore the faint tension coiling in her stomach, the same tension she used to feel before a difficult sortie. It had been years, decades even, since she had last experienced it. She had thought the feeling was gone forever, buried along with the rest of her past. But airplanes, real ones, flying through real skies, always carried echoes she could never fully silence. She reached the gate early and found a quiet corner seat. Passengers all around her chatted cheerfully, sipping coffees, scrolling their phones and tugging carry-ons behind them. None of them looked nervous. That was the strange thing about commercial flying. It made people forget how fragile a metal bird could be, how dependent it was on every bolt, every wire, every command from a pilot's steady hands. Alisaa envied their innocence sometimes. It must be peaceful, she thought, to trust the sky so completely. When pre-boarding began, she walked onto the jet bridge with slow, steady breaths. The familiar hum of the engines reached her before she even stepped inside the plane. It was a warm vibration under the floor panels, the heartbeat of a giant. Her fingers brushed the fuselage lightly as she stepped through the doorway, an old habit she had carried from her pilot days. Planes, she believed, deserved respect. They were more than machines, they were partners. "Welcome aboard," the flight attendant said with a bright smile. Alisaa returned a polite nod and moved toward her seat, 14A, a window seat as always. She sat down and buckled her seatbelt, folding her jacket neatly in her lap. Outside, the ground crew moved briskly, fueling and loading luggage. Everything seemed normal, yet something inside her whispered otherwise. A quiet voice, instinct, memory, or something deeper, kept tugging at her attention. She studied the passengers, families, business travelers, a group of college students on a trip, all blissfully unaware of the invisible weight she carried. Her mind drifted to the training drills she used to run, the emergency scenarios, rapid decision-making, all the things she had promised never to think about again. The engines roared to life, and the familiar vibration intensified. This was usually the part where Alisaa closed her eyes, shutting out the memories. But today, her eyelids refused to fall. Instead, she stared out the window as the Boeing 804 taxied smoothly across the runway. The sun reflected off the wing, casting bright silver streaks across the pavement. Cabin crew prepare for takeoff. The plane accelerated. Passengers leaned back in their seats. The wheels lifted. The ground fell away. Alisaa inhaled slowly as clouds approached, wrapping the aircraft in a soft white embrace. She almost allowed herself to relax. Almost. 20 minutes into the climb, it happened. A violent jolt shook the plane, throwing a few passengers forward. A tray table snapped open. Someone shouted in surprise. The seatbelt sign chimed loudly overhead, though most people were already secured. Alisaa's heart leaped, not in fear but in recognition. Then came the second jolt, stronger, sharper. A mechanical shudder ran through the fuselage like a warning cry. The lights flickered, and for a split second the cabin dimmed. A baby started wailing. A teenager gasped. The man beside Alisaa tightened his grip on his armrest until his knuckles turned white. Something was terribly wrong. Air turbulence didn't feel like this. Alisaa knew turbulence like she knew her own heartbeat. This was different. This was structural, mechanical, something deep inside the aircraft's systems misfiring. A low alarm sounded from the cockpit. Passengers couldn't hear the details, but Alisaa could read the expressions on the flight attendants' faces. Something had failed. Something big. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and breathless. "We are experiencing a critical systems malfunction. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Murmurs of fear rippled through the cabin. One woman started crying softly. A man whispered prayers under his breath. Alisaa's pulse remained controlled, steady, trained. Her mind automatically switched into assessment mode. She could tell from the angle of descent, from the sound of the engines, from the slight sway in the wings. Engine 2 wasn't responding properly. And worse, the main flight computer seemed to be losing synchronization. If that continued, manual control would be impossible. She closed her eyes for a second, not in fear, but in focus. The flight attendants hurried up and down the aisles, checking seatbelts, trying to keep the passengers calm. But Alisaa could see it, the subtle panic beneath their practiced smiles, the uncertainty trembling in their voices. Commercial crews. When Alisaa stood up, the entire cabin seemed to freeze. For a brief moment, she felt dozens of eyes following her every movement, hopeful, desperate, pleading. She had not expected the weight of their fear to hit her so sharply. It had been years since she had been responsible for anyone's life. Years since she had been the steady voice amid chaos. But now, every step she took forward felt strangely inevitable, as if the sky had been waiting for her return all along. A flight attendant hurried toward her, eyes wide with equal parts relief and shock. "Ma'am, are you trained? Were you crew?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Alisaa paused for a brief second before answering. It felt strange saying it aloud again. "I was a fighter pilot," she said quietly, "and I have experience with emergency aircraft recovery." The attendant blinked, almost disbelieving. "Please come with me." The captain asked for help. As Alisaa followed her up the aisle, the plane shuddered violently again. Overhead compartments rattled, and a suitcase fell open somewhere behind her. A child screamed. The engines groaned like metal being bent beyond its limits. She could sense it now with absolute clarity. The aircraft was losing primary control. The autopilot was failing, and the pilots were struggling to compensate. She reached the cockpit door. The attendant knocked twice sharply. "It's her," she said through the crack as the door opened. "She can help." The captain's face was a map of exhaustion, sweat along his brow, tension in his jaw, eyes sharp with fear but still fighting. "Are you truly trained?" he asked, urgency crackling in his voice. "We're losing the flight computer. Engine 2 isn't responsive and our manual override is unstable." "I know," Alisaa said as she stepped inside. Her voice was calm, not forced, not brave, simply trained. "Let me see your system readings." She slid into the jump seat behind the captain and scanned the screens. It didn't take her long. Years of high-pressure missions had trained her to read cockpit data at a glance. The Boeing 804 wasn't damaged beyond repair. Yet, but the electrical control grid was degrading fast. "How long since the first anomaly?" she asked. "10 minutes," the first officer replied, his voice tight. "That's too fast a decline for a simple electrical fault." Alisaa leaned closer. "It may be a cascading control failure, a software loop glitch. If the flight computer doesn't reset cleanly, it will keep shutting down essential subsystems one by one." "We tried resetting," the captain said. "It didn't respond." Alisaa tapped her fingers lightly on the console, a habit she used to have when solving difficult problems in the air. "Because you used a standard reset," she said. "In a cascading loop, you have to isolate before you reboot." The captain stared at her. "You know how to do that?" She met his gaze evenly. "Yes, I trained on the earliest versions of this flight control module. Let me help." Another violent jolt hit the plane. The nose dipped sharply before the captain managed to steady it. Warnings flashed across the screens: altitude hold failure, flight director offline, and the most terrifying of them all: control priority lost. They were running out of time. "Do it," the captain said. "Tell me what to switch." Alisaa leaned forward between the seats. "We need to isolate the malfunctioning module. First, shut down the secondary bus feed, then engage manual stabilizers on my mark." The first officer hesitated. "That's risky. We'll lose all tertiary support." "If we don't," Alisaa replied calmly, "we lose the aircraft." A beat of silence. Then the captain nodded. "Do as she says." The first officer executed the command. As predicted, more alarms blared, but the system's frantic flickering paused just for a moment. "Now reset the main computer," Alisaa said. "3 seconds only, no more. Then bring the stabilizers online manually." The captain hit the reset. For a heart-stopping second, the cockpit screens went dark. The plane dipped again, dropping several hundred feet. Passengers screamed behind them, but then the captain inhaled sharply. It worked. God, it actually worked. But the danger wasn't over. Alisaa checked the radar and altitude. "We're not out of this yet. The engine's only partially responsive, and with the control grid still vulnerable, we can't stay at cruising altitude." "So what do we do?" the first officer asked. "We descend," Alisaa said firmly. "We take control manually and find the nearest emergency landing strip. This plane cannot continue its scheduled route." The captain nodded slowly. "You're right. You're absolutely right." He turned to her. "Will you help us bring her down?" Alisaa rested her hand on the back of the captain's chair. "I didn't come this far to stop now." And for the first time in years, she felt the familiar steadiness of command settle into her bones. She was back not by choice but by fate, and she was ready. Alisaa stood between the captain and first officer, her hand braced on the back of the captain's seat, her eyes scanning every screen, every gauge. Though the main computer had been revived, it was unstable, like a heart that had been shocked back into rhythm but could collapse again without warning. "There's an old military-grade landing strip about 60 miles from here," Alisaa said, pointing to the radar screen. "It's remote, but long enough for a commercial aircraft. We can make it if we maintain a slow descent." The captain nodded, already adjusting the controls. "Show me the heading." She leaned in closer, drawing a line with her finger. "Here, keep the nose at a 5-degree angle. Any sharper and the right stabilizer won't handle the strain." Another tremor shook the aircraft. The first officer checked the engine readings. "Engine 2 is fluctuating again." "It'll hold," Alisaa said with steady confidence. "It has to." In truth, she wasn't entirely sure, but she knew that uncertainty had no place in a cockpit. Not now. She had learned long ago that fear was something you could feel, but never something you could allow others to see, especially not when lives depended on you. As they descended through a pocket of rough air, the cabin rattled. A loose seatbelt sign flickered, then went dark. A soft, muffled scream came from somewhere behind the cockpit door. Alisaa felt the weight of every soul on board pressing down on her shoulders. She hadn't expected to ever carry such a burden again, but here she was, guided not by choice, but by destiny. "Altitude 6,000 and dropping," the first officer reported. Alisaa peered out the small cockpit window. Through the breaks in the clouds, she could see faint outlines of rugged hills and dense forests. No cities, no airports, just a world of wilderness far below. "Keep steady," she said softly. "The strip should appear just past that ridge." The captain tightened his grip on the controls. "I hope you're right." "I trained on that land," she reminded him. "I know exactly where we are." A minute later, the clouds shifted, and there it was. A faded runway stretched in the midst of a large clearing, a relic from decades ago. Trees framed its edges, and several old structures stood nearby, long abandoned. It looked lonely, forgotten, yet perfect. "There," Alisaa said firmly, "that's our landing site." The captain exhaled, a mix of relief and fear. "All right, bringing landing gear down." The gear deployed with a heavy clunk. The plane dipped, aligning with the approaching runway, but engine 2 sputtered again. "Come on," the first officer whispered under his breath. "Hold together." Then it happened. A sudden blast of turbulence struck the aircraft, a brutal twisting jolt that tossed the plane sideways. Warning alarms screamed anew. The nose swayed off course. "Stabilize! Stabilize!" the captain shouted. "I've got it," Alisaa said instantly. Without hesitation, she took the auxiliary control column beside the captain, her hands steady as stone. She made rapid adjustments, tiny, precise corrections fighter pilots mastered through years of discipline. "Angle correction .3, rudder slight left. Now hold." The plane leveled again, though barely. The runway rushed toward them. "Brace," the captain said. This landing will be hard. The tires hit the ground with a violent thud. The plane bounced once, then slammed back down. Smoke puffed from the wheels as the brakes screamed. Everyone in the cabin was thrown forward against their belts. Loose objects crashed to the floor. Oxygen masks swayed wildly. But slowly, inch by inch, the aircraft began to slow. Then it slid to a halt. Silence washed over the plane. For a moment none of them breathed. Then a single sob broke out. A cry of relief, followed by cheering, clapping, and waves of overwhelming gratitude. The passengers, shaken but alive, erupted with emotion. The captain turned to Alisaa, eyes shining. "We never could have done that without you." Alisaa offered a small, tired smile. "You would have found a way, you're good pilots." But she knew the truth. She had saved them not for glory, not for recognition, simply because she could, because something deep within her had known she couldn't stand aside and watch fate take its course. When the emergency response vehicles arrived, TV channels and reporters tried to swarm the area, desperate for the identity of the mysterious woman who had brought down a dying aircraft. But Alisaa slipped away quietly, disappearing into the crowd just as she always did. Heroes didn't need headlines. She walked toward the trees, letting the breeze brush her face, the sky bright above her. She didn't look back. Some stories were meant to stay in the clouds. And at the very end of the emergency broadcast recording released later, one line appeared on the aviation team's channel. For more incredible real-life stories,
finally, the operation has been completed and the mission is successful. This is another kindness story for our viewers. Please continue to support us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our channel. We'll see you in the next story with another act of kindness. Until then, stay happy and spread happiness. Stay kind. Goodbye.